So I just have to set the stage first. These are Chautauqua-style presentations. If you haven't heard of Chautauqua-style, it is a form of presentation whereas there will be a scholar. You're all going to recognize her, of course. She's fabulous. But Chautauqua-style means we're going to go back in time. We're going to pretend like we're not in the present. This person will talk and act like a certain character, who I will tell you about that. So, we're going to hear from a very famous lady here in the Valley. She will talk for about 20 minutes or so. And then after that, if you want to ask her questions in the time period as a character, you are more than welcome to. We'll do that at the end. And then after that, our character will leave us and we'll come back to the present day with our scholar. And you can ask the scholar then any questions about the research of the character or anything like that. So that's kind of what the Chautauqua-style presentation is about. So our first character is not Scandalous. Don't worry, she's the second one. This one is a strong one. This is a strong woman who came here to the Valley. And you haven't heard of her. Her name is Captain Ellen E. Jack. And we're going to travel back in time. We're not going to be at the Wheeler Opera House. It's not going to be 2019. The year is 1903. So the crash happens here in Aspen in 1893. So this is about 10 years later. But we're not even going to be in Aspen. We are going up High Drive, which is outside Colorado Springs, up Bear Creek. And you're going to all pretend you are tourists traveling by car to visit Captain Jack at her tourist cabins and curio shop. So, you can take photos for a price. So everyone, please welcome Captain Ellen E. Jack.
Okay. Welcome to you all. I'm glad you could make it. You had a safe drive up the hill. I hope it was an interesting journey, if nothing less. And I hope you're here to, please, pictures, of course. Go ahead, here, let me get my axe. That'll be $5. She laughs. Well, welcome. I hope you're all in for a lovely evening. Dinner is being prepared. I just got back from a round over on Cheyenne Mountain where, well, I shouldn't really disclose, but I believe I found a cave bigger than the Cave of the Winds. No. So, more shall come. Please come and visit me more often. I don't know, have you ever met a female prospector before? Well, I got to tell you a little bit about myself, because I'm not your ordinary prospector. First off, I am a woman. I ain't afraid of man or the devil. You know, if he can shoot straighter or faster than I, let him go ahead and try. A 45 equalizes man and frail woman. I think every woman ought to be able to defend herself against such ruffians.
Amen. Amen.
However, this is what I have learned in my life. I've been 27 years here in the West, but I was actually born in England, Nottingham, England. That's where I was born, one of 9 children, raised on a beautiful farm that had belonged to my family for over 300 years. And my brothers entered into the military, my sisters did very well. We lost one sister to a fire, unfortunately. We had beautiful property, and I have to tell you just one story. This is my first story. You see, when I was 7 years old, the Goose Fair, which is held every year in Nottingham, was taking place just down the road from our farm. And I remember seeing the wagons coming in with the gypsies. And, you know, it was against the law for the gypsies to camp along the side of the road or in a land that wasn't owned by them. So they saw this beautiful farmland, and the queen of the gypsies came to me. It was the Boswell family gypsies. She asked me who owned the land. I said it was my mama. She asked me to take her to my mama, which I did. And my mother offered to let them stay for £5 she paid to stay on the ground. And the queen promised not to harm a blade of grass in the 3 weeks that they would be there. My mother did ask, though. She'd heard gypsies had the habit of stealing children, and would thee take mine? My mother asked. The queen of the gypsies vowed not to harm a hair on my head or any other head. She did, however, tell my mother that I was a Rosicrucian, a finder of hidden treasures, and that I would travel great distances, and that if I had been born a man, I would have been a great miner. She also said that I would be a widow at a very early age, and that fires would bring much sorrow and losses to me. I remember these words, and they all came true. Now, I grew up playing on the farm. My father finally decided to sell the farm and move to Manchester. He opened a brewery business, which failed miserably. We lost all of our family money. I went to live with one of my sisters, and it was there that I met my first love, Carl. He was Russian, and he was handsome, and he was educated, and he was a musician. And we would spend days rambling through the woods and singing and reading poetry together. And Carl vowed to take my hand in marriage, and I gave him my promise. Unfortunately, Carl was called back to serve in the military, and after 3 weeks of his return to Russia, in my sadness, my cousin asked me to join him at the opera. And I reluctantly went. That evening, following the performance, which I paid no attention to, my mind was far away with my lover. I was on the sidewalk. I was feeling faint, and my cousin Jack went to procure some roses for me. While he was buying the bouquet of roses, I was suddenly attacked and stabbed with a dagger on my bosom 3 times. I was so in shock, it was hard for me to imagine when I opened my eyes and saw Carl stabbing me. He said he did not want to see me alive would I be wed to another man. He was mad with jealousy. Now I fainted for loss of blood. Carl was arrested and thrown into jail. I was taken home, and they found that the stab wounds were about 1.5 inches from my heart. And my heart, although it took a long time to recover, was broken from the sadness. How could a man who had promised me his hand with such confidence have been so savage? I convalesced for 18 weeks with my sister, and all that time, Carl was in jail. He finally paid a hefty fine, and when he was out, he came and called upon me, wanting to be with me, and I was so frightened of him, and my sister made sure that he was never allowed in the house. My sister decided it was a time for me to travel to America. So she and her husband took me at the age of 17 on a ship to New York City. It was an amazing journey. I was seasick for the first few days, but then the air cleared, and it was a lovely passage for a few weeks until a storm came. The storm was so terrible, we all had to take shelter down in the lower berths. People were being injured, and, for some reason, I've always found myself able to bear the sight of blood. And I actually had to assist a doctor in the amputation of a young Irish girl's legs that had been crushed as she was thrown against a steel door. Now, when we landed in New York City, I had never seen anything so beautiful in all of my life. It was a beautiful harbor, and we stayed at a beautiful hotel that was right on the corner of Broadway and 14th Street. We stayed for 6 weeks, and then I became ill. I became jaundice, and as my sister and her husband returned, I was unable to make the voyage. So they secured a nurse who cared for me until I was then able to travel back to England. This was in March of 1860. And on that journey, as I was boarding the gangplank, still very, very sick with jaundice, the first captain came down, lifted me in his arms, and carried me aboard. And I am told from him that he claimed at that moment he was going to wed that canary. You see, my face was as blonde, was as yellow as my hair. He wooed me for 5 weeks on that journey, and when we landed in England, he had to return with the ship under contract back to New York City. But he vowed to come back and wed with me. And in September of 1860, I wed Charles E. Jack. And we returned to New York City to live with his family in Brooklyn. Shortly thereafter, my husband entered into the Navy, and we entered into the Civil War. My husband took the tests and became a captain. and worked under Farragut's fleet and was down in New Orleans and suffered some severe injuries at that time. But following the war, he returned and worked within the Navy Yards in New York, and we had a beautiful small home up in New Rochelle, and his family was still in Brooklyn, and I'd had my first child, Nettie. Nettie was a lovely girl. She lived to be 5 years old. She died shortly after my son was born. My son contracted scarlet fever, and Nettie joined him. On her deathbed, she said to me, "But Mama, I must go with him, and you will join us, and we will all be together one day." My heart was broken. My husband returned to serve more in the military, and as I was lonely, I began to help and care for those who were in need on Randall's Island. Shortly thereafter, my third child was born, Jenny. She was a light. And 2 years later, my fourth child, Daisy, born in the spring, as you can imagine, and named after the beautiful flower because she lit up a room. Now, Daisy was a rare child. Why, I remember a Christmas shortly after my husband died. You see, Charles was 15 years older than I, and he had suffered severe injuries in the Civil War that affected his heart, and his heart failed him. And on his deathbed, again, I heard voices that said, "Do not worry, let him go. We will take care of him." And in the corner of the room, I saw Nettie and my boy waiting for my husband. He joined them shortly thereafter. My grief, a pen cannot describe the suffering that I went through. That winter, having to take care of my girls as best I could with what little money I had, I began to invest in real estate in Prospect Park area of Brooklyn. I bought a large plot of land and I built a very large hotel. It was the Bon Ton Hotel, and we did very well. I've always had a way of knowing what to do next. I made very good investments, and we made very well through the hotel. I bought several presents for my girls that Christmas, and Daisy, I found, was gone on Christmas morning. And when I found her, she was down the block where an old beggar woman had nothing to eat, and my Daisy had brought her her Christmas dinner. Daisy was a rare and gifted child, I said. Daisy, too, was lost to scarlet fever. At this point, my heart was broken. I could no longer stay in this city. I could no longer stay with this family. I gave my daughter Jenny to my sister-in-law. I enrolled her in boarding school and made sure that she would be taken care of forever. And I headed west. I made off to Denver. When I arrived in Denver, I ran into our old nurse girl, Jenny. Jenny looked beautiful, beautifully dressed. We met on Holiday Street, and I found out that not only had she married upon leaving my employment, but that her husband had not treated her fairly. Her husband had beaten her when he would return in the evenings. One night she followed him to see where he was, and she found that he was spending his nights in a sporting house, enjoying other women. Well, this not only devastated Jenny, it burned her, and she decided that she would spend the rest of her life making men pay. For why should a good woman have to suffer when the women who were enjoying the gaiety and laughter and love have all the benefit? So Jenny had opened a sporting house on Holiday Street. She was going by the name of Madame Clara Dumont. I went to visit her under an assumed name myself, as I was not accustomed to visiting sporting houses. And she told me that I should travel west to Gunnison, a new city, a mining camp at that time, still. So I encountered a group of men that had a stage heading off towards Gunnison, and after 3 days' wait, I journeyed with them. I was the only woman, but I had my 44 with me. And that, in itself, was enough to secure my position on the stage in the eyes of these men, one of whom was Alva Adams. who has been our governor twice here in the state of Colorado. He was a hardware merchant at that time, heading to the Gunnison camp. When we arrived in Gunnison, there were many men and not many homes. I was able to meet a cowboy named Hall who helped secure some land for me. I bought 2 large lots. I secured a tent and the lumber was delivered, and I put up a large tent and began to charge men and freighters 50 cents a night to stay. I had a beautiful long dining table made and 3-legged stools so that I could serve dinner, and I began to prepare meals. One fall, why, the Ute Indians were still in the area, in the agency, and in that fall, I came home one day to the tent to find the Indians were dancing around and eating all of the beautiful apples that I had procured. Well, I was dismayed, and soon they were surrounding me, and I heard a man shout, "Hold your ground! They've caught into some firewater, but they only want to touch your hair." You see, I was a blonde back then. So I went to the Chief Colorado, and I took his hand, and I undid my hair, and I let him touch my hair. In fact, he was so enamored that I cut a lock off and I pinned it onto his blanket, and he kept it with him. It was in another Ute uprising that played very well to my benefit. You see, the Indians had come into town and they had knocked over lanterns, and oil had started fires all throughout town, and I took my .44 and I shot it up into the air, and the gunshots brought other men that came to start the fight, and as the fight was going on, I was hit in the head with a tomahawk, and I fell to the ground, not realizing that I was bleeding profusely. It turns out the tomahawk had been poisoned. And it was Chief Colrose who came to save me. As he came through town under a white blanket, shouting, "Pale lady, I come to save pale lady, pale lady." Because of my friendship with him, he was able to cure me. He put something on my head that I wore for weeks, a paste, and gave me a pill the size of a bullet. After several weeks, a blood clot burst, and the poison was free from my body, but I still have the scar, which is why I wear my hair down over my forehead. Now, many men found me irresistible, I must say. It was difficult for me to thwart off all of their advances. But I made it very clear that I was to be left alone, and I found very good allies who helped me with that. Several of them were prospectors, and in the course of that, I began prospecting. I began to search through the mountains and learn of all the minerals that were there. And in fact, I took a half interest in the Black Queen Mine. It was 1 mile north of the city of Crystal, up in the mountains in between Aspen and Crested Butte. And getting there was no easy chore because there was no road. But I made my journey there several times and secured our options there, and we began to produce quite a bit of ore. $20 a ton was what was being pulled out of that mine. And all of that rock had to be carried back down the mountain with mules and burros, and I became very accustomed to all of this lifestyle. Hardly what I had thought would be the point of my life. But several of the men that I met along the way thought they could take advantage of me, being a fair, blonde woman. Now, Mr. Walsh, he was 20 years older than I, and he was very educated, he was very smart, and claimed to have lots of money from his family back in Cincinnati. He asked me to wed, and I said no, I thought better of it. But he kept insisting, and eventually I thought, well, he is older, therefore I would have both father and husband. And so I agreed. We went to Denver for the ceremony, and the night before the wedding, I heard the crying of several children's voices, crying and pleading with me not to do it. "Do not marry, do not marry," they kept saying. And in fact, as we were standing in front of the priest, about to put the rings on our fingers, I heard a man's voice loud and clear over my shoulder, so loud, screaming, "No!" that I dropped the ring. It rolled on the ground. The priest picked it up, gave it to Mr. Walsh, who shoved it onto my finger, and we were wed. Well, Mr. Walsh went off to tend to some business, and I waited for him, and I waited for him, and I waited for him that day. He did not return at 5 o'clock. By 6:20, I boarded the freighter and headed back over to Gunnison. It was 2 weeks before Mr. Walsh came again. It turns out Mr. Walsh was not a man of integrity. Mr. Walsh was actually a con man, as I have learned. And he was after my mine. He wanted half of whatever I owned, which includes Jack's cabins, which included the mine, which included, I forgot to mention my boarding house here in Aspen. You see, in 1885, I had traveled over the mountains from Crystal, over what I believe now is called Maroon Pass, into Aspen. And I did it in the wintertime. And I did it on a night when the men were too afraid to go. You see, there'd been a wash, and there was a gully, and a man and his horse had already been killed. There were several men that were building the road eventually to come up over that way, and they pleaded with me not to go. Do not continue your journey. But I knew I had to go. My voices were telling me, go on, go on. And at this point, I had learned that I should listen to what I was hearing. So I traveled on. When we came to that wash, it was a crevice that we both, my horse and I, and the dog that was traveling with me, Mandy, had to jump. And as we did, I was unsure of what was found on the other side. But we landed safely. We continued on and made our way down into Aspen. When we arrived, we were approached by so many people asking, how did we possibly do it? Did the other men come with us? Have we heard from them? You see, that night before I had come into town, having crossed the crevice and camped for an evening, I heard crying and screaming, which I assumed to be that of coyotes and wolves. It turns out there was a great avalanche that took the lives of all the men that were working on that road. And had I stayed with them, I would not be here today. So I listen to the voices now as they tell me what to do. I came into Aspen and I built a beautiful house on a corner lot, and I started renting rooms and serving food. I made $400 a month here. But I had to go back to the Black Queen mine to tend to my interests, because you see, there were men that were trying to steal the ore from my mine. And when I went and found them with bushels on their burros and about to leave with the minerals that belonged to me, I began to shoot. And as I did, the burros and the men fell down a cliffside. There were several men killed and 7 burros as well. Now the stories became exaggerated, and it sounded as though I had killed 7 men. Well, that was not entirely true, but I was arrested. And I was arrested for protecting my own property. And I was acquitted. I was arrested again. Sorry?
That's the voices.
I couldn't quite hear them, though. So, you see, I was arrested a second time, and this was because I was collecting pension from Mr. Walsh, and it turned out I was never really married to Mr. Walsh, because you see, Mr. Walsh had already been married. He had a wife and 2 children whom he had sent off to Canada. Come to find they died from diphtheria. And Mr. Walsh, he too eventually died, but I had to spend years and a fortune in the courts trying to prove myself and my rights. It turns out that I ended up getting the pension from Captain Jack. And all of his back money and pension are what I sank into these beautiful cabins here, outside of Colorado Springs. You see, I'm getting a little too old to be prospecting and mining and fighting off mountain lions and avalanches. It's a bit much for me. So I have decided that I am going to open this curio shop and write a memoir. You see, I've only told you a few of the stories of my life. There are so many, many more, and many of them are true. And if they aren't, they ought to be. I'm happy that you are here this evening. I would encourage you to buy a postcard. I would encourage you to come back and visit often. And I do believe that this will be my next great fortune. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Jack. That was most informative. Does anybody have any questions for Captain Jack? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering how you got captain.
She wants to know how she got to become captain.
Well, my name is Ellen. Elliot is my maiden name, Jack. But I assumed my husband's moniker of Captain Jack. It seemed to carry a little more weight in these mountain towns.
Yes.
Did any of your children survive?
Did any of her children survive?
My daughter, Jenny. Although I had to not encounter her, it was too difficult. There's a question in the back.
Where was the boarding house in Aspen located?
Yeah.
There's the boarding house.
It was on a beautiful corner lot. I don't recall the names of the streets.
Oh.
That was a good almost 20 years ago. I'm good, but I'm not that good. Yes, ma'am.
Why do you have a candle in your hand?
Why does she have a candle in her hat?
Oh, have you never seen a stick and Tommy before?
No.
Oh, well, this is what I carry into the caves as I go looking, and I'm able to secure it either on the side of the wall, or I can just jack it into the wall, and therefore I have light. And I made the candle.
Any other questions for Captain
Yes, ma'am.
How did you come to live in Colorado Springs?
How did she get to Colorado Springs?
There's beautiful mountains outside of Colorado Springs, and there were many tourists beginning to travel by car, and I thank you. So I found that this would be an easier situation for me in my later years.
How late did you live?
How late did you live?
How old are you?
Any more questions?
Any more questions for Captain Jack? Thank you, Jesse.
How old are you right now? What year is it?
There you go.
It's 19.
1903. I was born on November 4th in 1842.
When did you die?
It's 1903, remember?
Perhaps we should advance.
Yes, I think so too. All right, if there's no more questions, ladies and gentlemen, you all know her.
So she lived until 1921. She did die in Colorado Springs. She had a home down, a winter home down in Colorado Springs. She actually had a boarding house there for a while on Bennett and 4th. In the spring of 1921, there was a great flood, and it washed out the road up to High Drive where she had her cabins, and she wasn't able to return. She died of a leakage of a heart, they say, although the story is that she had a broken heart, not being able to return. She had snakes and macaws and all sorts of exotic animals up at her cabins.
Oh, wow.
She was one of a kind.
Yes.
And this is a new character. Nina just started to research her a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
So.
And she did write a
Yeah.
memoir.
Again?
Again, most of the stories are true. They're her stories. Okay? She wrote a wonderful book. I don't think I have it. Oh, yeah, I do. This is the book she wrote. Captain Jack.
Jack, yeah, it's the name of the book.
And it's called, the subtitle, what's the subtitle? It's 27 Years in the West, but it's something about a ferry.
The Fate of a Fairy, or 27 Years in the Far West.
There you go.
That's what it says.
She was often
Yeah.
referred to as a fairy. Not
Fairy,
as
yeah.
a fairy. A delicate. She was a small woman. And but she resisted things like, you know, when she was in Denver, she was encountered by men who said, you know, come and work with us in our dance hall and you'll make a great fortune because of your, you know, fair skin and your blonde hair. And that was not happening. That was not part of what she was supposed to be doing. She was a woman of integrity and strength. Wow. Yeah.
So does anyone
Unbridled strength and great spiritual beliefs. She believed in 3 powers: electricity, vibration, and waves. Later in her life, she predicted that airwaves would carry people. Passages of the airwaves, and that you know, there would be something other than horses to operate machines. And she predicted a lot of things. She had a lot of prescient. Yeah. There's a word. It is not me. So, any other questions?
Anyone have questions for Nina about the research or anything?
It was difficult to find where her house was here in Aspen. Yeah. She is listed in the 1885 census that we have in the archive as Helen E. Jack, but a widow, the right age, and from England, so I know it's her. Oftentimes names were misspelled or, you know, incorrectly. It was hard to read what people wrote.
But there's no record.
Real estate. But there's no, I have not been able to find it, and I did a little bit of research, but I found that, you know, that wasn't really an interesting sticking point that I needed to spend a lot of time on. So I will continue to do more research about her and hopefully find out where it was. But she bought it from some older woman who was selling it at that time. In 85, 86, Aspen wasn't a sure thing yet. There were still a lot of battles going on within the courts that hadn't secured the success of Aspen at that time.
So maybe on the east side, where the other sporting houses were?
It wasn't a sporting house.
She
did not operate a sporting house.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Oh, sorry.
A boarding house is where men came and stayed and
Gotcha.
she got a meal.
Sorry.
Not
my
a
fault.
sporting house. She was not a madam. She did not operate in that circle. Any other questions?
for Nina?
She didn't reunite with her daughter?
Did you
Not that I
ever
know of.
reunite with Jenny? No.
Not that I know of. I can't find
That's a
any
good question.
of the daughter, who probably took on the sister-in-law's maiden name. So it was her husband Jack's brother's family. So I haven't been able to find it yet.
Hopefully we will.
Yeah.
Yes.
What happened to her money after she died?
She didn't die with a lot. She wasn't very successful. There was another woman in the area who was also running the same kind of cabins who did a better job at it, let's put it that way, who actually bought up her cabins, and they were there until 1965 when they were torn down.
Any other questions for Nina?
Don't tear down history.
All right, well, Nina, I think we're good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Everybody, Nina Gabianelli. So that wraps up our first Chautauqua presentation. We're going to take about maybe a 5-minute-ish break. If anybody wants to go to the bathroom, get another drink or snack at the bar, you're more than welcome to. And we'll be back shortly.
Thank you all for coming. Your attendance here today is a tribute and an honor to a remarkable woman. As Undertaker Mr. Allen said, I am Molly Ross, and Camille Ritchie was a boarder of mine. She was warm-hearted and loyal, as many of us here can attest, and was one of the most elegant and gifted women I have been privileged to know. As I look out among you all, I am overwhelmed and touched to see not only so many of our fraternity of women here today, but so many of the citizens of Aspen. Those who knew Camille in life, we represent all corners of Aspen. This is unusual, wouldn't you agree? I believe the Reverend Mr. Duck expressed it best at the Camille service when he described death as a great leveler and Camille's grave laying side by side with the innocent, looks very much the same. I have noticed that some of you seemed rather curious about Camille's style of life and the lives of my associates and I. Oh, it is not my intention to be rude or criticize, but rather, on this rare occasion when we are all together, open up a door of communication. I am glad to quench any curiosity that you may have about our lives in, as one reporter put it, the dizzy old grotto of Durant. Would you like to know about our way of life? Yeah. Hear some of our stories? Yeah. Well, for those of you who do not already know or are new to Aspen, I suppose I should begin by explaining the hierarchy of our profession. There are madams, parlor house girls, brothel women, crib girls, and street walkers. Do I shock you? No? Well, then I shall continue. Madams are the highest ranking of all women of ill repute, although it is not polite to refer to us as madams. One simply says that she keeps a house. I keep a parlor house and act almost as a mother to my girls. This lifestyle is a challenging one, and the girls in this profession are prone to fits of melancholy and ill temper. It is my job to pacify the girls, care for them when they take ill, protect them from the law, and protect them from rough custom. She wasn't invited. For my effort, I receive a portion of the profit. The majority of the women who keep houses were once boarders themselves, but have either grown too old to continue or have funds enough to establish a house of their own. Directly below in status are the parlor house girls, or these parlor houses or bordellos are establishments of refinement and are the elite among the houses of ill fame. Therefore, any woman working in one shares that elevated rank. Parlor house girls are well educated, well bred, musically trained, excellent conversationalists, and physical beauties. These houses are managed by a woman like me, who takes especially good care of her boarders. Parlor houses attract men of distinction who are looking for an evening of entertainment, as opposed to an hour or two of frivolity. In Aspen, these establishments are situated on the mountainside of Durant Avenue, directly east of Galena Street. Those who do not make the grade of parlor house girl may work as brothel women in what is referred to in polite society as a boarding house. While many of these girls have good dispositions, they are not the same quality as parlor house girls. One may recognize a brothel woman by her display in a boarding house window. Women in boarding houses tend to find themselves on the center of trouble quite often, usually as a result of alcohol and drug abuse. And the woman who manages a boarding house is kept very busy trying to maintain order. The next level of trade on Durant Avenue, and a considerable drop in situation from boarding house women, are crib girls. These girls work and live out of tiny rooms known as cribs, which are located on the east end of Durant Avenue. These rooms are situated in rows with entrances directly out onto the street, and they have only enough room for a bed, a dresser, and perhaps a chair. Crib girls are self-employed and seek custom by standing scantily dressed in their doorways soliciting. Because crib girls do not command a high price, turnover is their method of business, and the customers are treated to speedy encounters. Sometimes lasting only 5 minutes for as little as 25 cents. In fact, men are not even permitted to remove their boots and clothing, as doing so would cut into profits. The majority of women who keep houses were once, the lowest in status, and the most unfortunate of women on Durant Avenue, are the streetwalkers, the true ladies of the lamplight. They, like crib girls, have no mistress to look after them, but they do not even have a premise from which to entertain their customers. They are left to the dangers of going with a man to his lodgings, or even completing a transaction in the alleyways. These women are regularly abused, robbed, are usually intoxicated, and often their wares are taken without any compensation. Streetwalking is a pitiful and dangerous existence, and these women have no hopes of ever rising in the ranks to a better situation. As most of you are aware, we sporting women are confined in Aspen to the southeast area of the city on Durant Avenue and are not permitted to conduct business west of Galena Street, as per a city ordinance passed in early 1885. Some of you may recall that it created quite a stir in Aspen, as many respectable families lived and still live within these defined borders. And they were often treated to rather raucous displays. One can hardly forget the incident concerning Skip Stewart and Nellie Otis. After partaking in libations all day, Miss Stewart proceeded to fire empty beer bottles against Nellie Otis's boarding house in the middle of the night. When Miss Otis came to the door, Miss Stewart began to pound on Nellie while yelling profanities loud enough for the entire block to hear. If the incident wasn't so shocking, one might be impressed that during the struggle, the intoxicated Miss Stewart not only managed to rearrange the features of Miss Otis's face, but also become possessed of Nellie's diamond pin and necklace. Now, around the time of the ordinance restricting sporting houses to a certain section of Aspen, a tax was imposed on the women of Durant Avenue and the owners of gambling saloons. But it was not called a tax. It was called a fine. You see, state law prohibits gambling and prostitution, so local government cannot rightly legalize it by imposing a tax. Instead, the city imposed a fine. The price? $25 each month from gambling saloons and sporting houses, and $5 each month from every single woman of ill repute. The offenders must go to the courthouse voluntarily once a month to pay the fine to the marshal for engaging in illegal activities. The money is added to the city treasury, and our activities are overlooked. Some call it a tax, city officials call it a fine, we call it a license. As I mentioned, I keep a parlor house on Durant Avenue. Before I came to Aspen, I lived in Leadville, where I boarded at one of the prominent parlor house. While I invested much of my earnings back into my wardrobe, I also put aside a fair amount for future investments. Therefore, when the opportunity arose for me to come to the new mining camp in Aspen, I seized it and now run one of the most respected establishments in the district. I currently boast 25 boarders of the highest quality, wit and unsurpassing beauty. One will find that so many of the women on Durant Avenue appear sickly and underfed. My girls are well cared for and maintain the plush figures desirable to today's gentlemen. I rarely accept a boarder under 200 pounds in weight. But none of the best parlors do, of course. My girls are schooled in the art of etiquette and the art of conversation. They are dressed in the finest, latest fashions and are forbidden to utter a foul word. As a result of such quality, I attract the most distinguished guest in Aspen. I maintain a discreet and luxurious establishment where gentlemen may come for an evening of relaxation in a parlor equipped with important furnishings, art, music played by beautiful ladies on a grand piano and a golden harp, an impressive selection of drink, and stimulating and witty conversation before any attention is paid to the upper floors. As you well may have deduced, a parlor house is the situation to which women of the trade aspire. Aside from living a life of luxury, they are paid very well. Most women in my parlor entertain only 1 or 2 gentlemen a night, whereas a boarding house woman will see several. A crib girl can see 30 to 50 men in one day, and barely affords the tax to maintain her business. I also pay very generous fees for Durant Avenue. My girls retain 50% of their earnings, and they bring in between $100 and $200 each week. Sound good? Which makes this a rather lucrative career. The other 50% comes to me, and I spend much of it on the care of my boarders, the maintenance of our luxurious dwellings, superior refreshments for our customers, and a multitude of fines and fees which are routine expenses in our profession. We pay our taxes, or rather fines, any court fees that may arise from our boarders, and any attorney fees. The legal expenses are considerable, but they are expected in a business that trespasses upon the law. Of course, the general public has always been willing to wink at the infractions of the law conducted in our dwellings, as long as, how was it put? Evil was kept secluded, and the creatures who lived such lives shall not obtrude themselves upon the public gaze. Yes, I believe that was it. I can tell you, though, that the district lines have been challenged at times. Several colored women from Leadville took up premises outside the designated limits. City Councilman Alderman Hoops reacted with a motion to fine and remove the women and collected signed petitions of support. The following week, still triumphing from his success, he collected another petition, this time against Molly Keys for keeping a house directly across the street, only yards from the border. To everyone's surprise, however, Mr. Hoops suddenly withdrew the petition. When asked why, he explained that one of the signers of the petition had rented a house to a person of bad character. When asked which of the petitioners he was referring to, he reluctantly answered, "Me." I am most certainly of the opinion that it is far easier and safer to remain within our quarters, although our quarters are not necessarily safe. Oh, those of us who keep establishments do our best to protect our girls, but our trade is a game of chance, especially for the women who are working in cribs or on the streets. They are victims of violence, often beaten right in public, and yet they are the ones who are brought to court and fined for it. I find it just curious that we pay some of the highest taxes in this city, but we do not receive the benefits of its protection. In any case, violence, disease, pregnancy, abortion, and even death are threats that every woman faces on Durant Avenue, even in the safety of my own parlor. You are all likely familiar with my own recent misfortune. The newspapers certainly covered it. It is true. I did have two admirers. One was Mr. W.E.O. Coe, a gentleman from a good family in Ohio, and one of Aspen's earliest settlers. The other was a lesser known, but an unfailing gentleman, Mr. Miller. I had been involved with Mr. Coe for some time before my acquaintance with Mr. Miller, but it was not long after meeting him that I realized I preferred Mr. Miller exclusively. Mr. Coe had a violent streak in him, and I suppose I may have mentioned it to a few women on Durant. Well, Billy, Mr. Coe, came to my house one day quite excitable, and he said he had come to get satisfaction. Mr. Miller, who was with me at the time, trying to calm him, but Billy came at me saying that he had been all over the hook shops, and he had heard that I had been saying stuff about him. He proceeded to take hold of me by my waist and demanded that I sign a paper contradicting what I had said. I tried to calm him down, but he began choking me, and I fell to the floor with Billy on top of me. Mr. Miller was yelling at Billy for him to get off, to stop. Then I heard gunshots, and then I saw that Mr. Miller was shooting at Billy. And just as Billy looked up, a bullet struck him in the head. But Billy jumped up and began chasing Mr. Miller, firing bullets at him, yelling, "Murder!" I screamed for Mr. Miller to run because Billy was so close behind. But then Billy just fell, and it was all over. Mr. Miller was defending me. I just hope the courts see it that way. I believe you are all wondering why any woman would want to become a denizen of Durant. Well, many women do not have any other choice. They are widows with children to support, no family, and no other viable way of earning a living. Some women are married, and their husbands cannot support their families. So it is decided either by the husband or by both that she should work a few days a week to assist with the family income. There are also those who are raised in brothels by their mothers. They learned the trade at a very young age and continued in the business. I know of a boarding home in Leadville that was a family business. The home was owned, run, and operated by 3 sisters and their daughters. Of course, there are women who are seeking excitement or an acceptable way to satisfy their earthly hunger. But they learn realities of this profession very soon. You might be surprised at how many come from refined and wealthy homes and leave for so many reasons. Several of these women have been taken advantage of by a man at some point in their lives, blamed for it, and then been labeled a soiled dove. These women are no longer accepted among the families of society, and they have no other choice but to become actual soiled doves. Then there are the women who come from poor, broken homes and are just hoping to improve their situation, perhaps marry one of their customers. So many of the girls in Durant Avenue set their hopes on securing a husband from among their customers, and most are gravely disappointed. However, a few manage to make matches. One of my former boarders is very happily settled on a ranch with a fine young man. Oh, but that's a rarity. The women in this trade aspire to manage their own house one day, which is challenging but achievable if the woman is prudent with her earnings while she is in the trade and has a good sense of business. Others hope to work just long enough to retire to another town in comfort. The majority, however, perish early to disease-related illness, drugs, violence, failed abortions, and suicide. Though tragedy touches all on Durant Avenue, I am fortunate not to encounter the number of incidents that occur so frequently in other establishments. Oh, there are scuffles between the girls at times, but those are easily managed. What is more challenging to manage is our guests when they have had more to drink than is good for them. Also was not invited. Perhaps you heard about the attempted robbery 2 nights ago on the Brown Hug block, Cooper Avenue and Galena Streets? Oh, well, a certain personage who shall remain unnamed, I believe that you may know to whom I'm referring, though. This person was strolling along with a lady of the lamplight when he was held up by a handkerchief-wearing bandit. The thief demanded that they put up their hands and proceeded to frisk the gentleman, who tried to explain that he did not have any money because he spent all of it on Durant Avenue. The thief continued to search, and when he could not find anything, he turned dejected and slunk off. Pity it did not occur to the thief to search the young lady. For if he had, he would have found the gentleman's recently departed wad of money rolled up in her hosiery. Well, we do have our fair share of trouble in our part of town, but we have always done our very level best not to impose it on the rest of the city, and I believe we have managed very well. That is, until the Colorado Midland Railroad reached Aspen in 1888. As you all know, the railroad was built on Dean Street, which is 1 block south of Durant Avenue. Residents and visitors now had to pass through Durant in order to get to and from the railroad, and many were witnessing our way of life for the very first time, instead of just hearing about it. The solicitations and display of wantonness was a subject of disapproval among many of the residents. And all too soon, the relocation of the denizens of Durant became a topic of conversation among residents and in the courts. In November of the same year, 1888, many of our women were brought before the grand jury of the district court and accused of running illegal houses of ill repute. The courts were well aware that we were running houses of ill repute. The women testified that they turn over their taxes each month to the marshal and therefore should be allowed to remain. It was all rather dubious. After all, there was an ordinance currently in place confining our businesses, in effect acknowledging and allowing our businesses to operate within a designated district. And now they were issuing indictments against us because of them? Mind you, these were the very businesses whose monthly taxes built this mining camp into a city. The women were released from court that day with the promise that they would be called to return at a later date. Our date in court arrived only 2 weeks later, and on the 1st of December 1888, I am sure that you all remember recollecting the recounting of it in the newspapers. I believe it was referred to as the lewd house court cases. I was particularly described in the article. Oh, not by name, but I was, and I quote, the most gorgeously dressed of the whole crew, who took out and held up in a conspicuous manner a sign upon which was printed in bold characters the word license. Oh, we were a motley crew. Indeed, parading into the courthouse, some in their colorful evening wear with giant plumes. Many of the women saw it as an advertising opportunity. Oh, it was May on the swoosh of skirts, the heavy perfume, and the chatter. It quite overwhelmed the court. Sheriff White was rapping for order, while chairs were being brought in to accommodate the ladies, as well as the crowd of spectators who had come to watch the proceedings. Officer Webb was stumbling among us, distributing indictments. But once the courtroom was finally settled and quiet, District Attorney Taylor proceeded to call out the names of the proprietesses of the sporting houses on Durant Avenue, as well as the owners of the houses. 27 women were charged with keeping houses of ill repute, and 8 men were charged with owning houses that accommodate such businesses. They wanted us off Durant Avenue and threatened that legal action would continue until we left. There was never any thought of indicting us until the Midland Depot was built. We were no longer hidden from public view, and there was a prospect of property on Durant Avenue becoming more valuable. But where were we to go? It did not take long for the residents of Aspen to consider what our relocation would mean to them. If we were not sequestered within our part of town, it would leave us to take up residence where we could find it, scattered throughout town among families and respectable businesses. Oh, I was actually amused by Mayor Carson's solution to the problem. He issued an order requiring that all window blinds on sporting houses be kept down, and that the women be kept off the street. Oh, it has not affected my establishment in the least, as my guests seek my parlor specifically. But the houses and cribs that rely on store windows to advertise their wares have been greatly affected. Ellen Miller refused to comply, sending her girls out to fetch business. Miss Miller was taken to court, and the following night, all the blinds were down on Durant Avenue. And the avenue was quiet for the first time. However, I have noticed that most of the blinds on Durant Avenue seem to be in considerable disrepair. They have gray tears right in the middle, about eye level to a gentleman who might be strolling by. Oh, the discussion of our relocation off Durant Avenue has become a moot point, however, because a much greater issue is currently threatening Aspen's prosperity and ultimately its survival. As you all know, the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act was repealed last year in the autumn of 1893. As a result, the silver prices plummeted overnight, and everything in Aspen changed. So many of our mines have closed or are barely operating. Miners and their families have left Aspen, and so have the women on Durant. Many of the girls have gone on to the gold mining town of Cripple Creek, where there may be more success. Others have returned to Leadville, Denver, and have even gone back east. And many have sought new territories further west. Only the most successful businesses on Durant continue to endure. I wonder how many more residents will leave Aspen and whether the city will be able to survive. But without mining, whatever is there by way of commerce to ensure Aspen's future? Well, one cannot dwell on what has yet to be. Oh, gracious, I have been chattering on for some time now, and it is late. Oh, thank you all again for coming to see our dear Camille off. And thank you for this fine and rare afternoon. Death is a great leveler, and all of us, standing side by side, look very much the same. We set off back to 513 Durant Avenue.
Thank you, Miss Molly. That was a lovely service. I'm sure Camille would very much appreciate it.
Oh, sure.
Yes. So, does anyone have any questions for Miss Molly Ross?
How many did you have at one time?
How many ladies did you house?
Ladies of the night, I would say we had 25 boarders in Mai, which is a large number and attracts a lot of people because they know if you have that many women who are well kept, that you must be some kind of an establishment. Women who come and go to other mining towns. It's hard to retain them, but having that many beautiful women, so many choices.
Decisions. Gentlemen, look at you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious when Floridora came into being, since it's on the wrong side of the tracks.
When Floridora?
Yes.
Do I need help from Nina?
I don't believe it exists at this time.
Oh, Floridora, is
So
that
did it exist before or after?
We'll have to answer that question in a bit.
There we go.
Stay with us.
Thank you.
Stay with the programming.
Yes, ma'am. In the back.
So when the economy was compromised and your borders were dispersing, what did you do?
What did you do?
Well,
after the crash?
so far, I can't see into the future as it is 1895. But Molly was able to, I have been able to maintain my brothel, my bordello. Bordello is a little higher class, and so therefore it could attract more people and have more proceeds to maintain itself for a while. And if I can answer as Kimberly at some point, but we can hold
Yes,
that.
we'll do that a little bit.
Is it Kimberly time or is it
I don't
still
know.
Molly?
Any more
Molly questions? And I can get back.
Miss Molly?
Yes.
sir.
How many houses were there on the street? How many women were in the town?
Altogether.
Altogether, that's a very good question. I don't know, but there were a considerable amount. Galena Street, of course, the part that's closer to, Durant, near Galena was the higher end, where the bordellos were, the bigger, more beautiful, more expensive houses. But it went all the way down, I think, as far as, in the future, there's a place called City Market. And it stretched down, and that's where the crib houses were. And I think we all even saw those on the
I
maps
believe so.
for the Aspen Historic Society.
At that time in Aspen, there were over 12,000 people by 1883, so there were a lot of people.
And there are a lot of women, because it was a mining town, although we can talk more about that, how this was a family-oriented,
Yes.
a little different.
Yes, in the back. Somebody have their hand?
Any more, Molly?
If I missed it, how did you come to be the proprietor?
How did you come to
Well, I did very well in Leadville. I was
But how
at
did you come to be in that line?
How did you get into the profession,
well,
Miss Molly?
I think it's time for me to become someone other than
Okay.
Molly.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was Miss Molly Ross. And the woman before you is Kimberly Rehfuss, right?
Rehfuss.
Yes. Sorry, Kimberly Rehfuss. As you can tell, has done a lot of research about the women of the night, as we call them here in town. So she would now be happy to answer any present day questions.
As I can. And
Yes.
just as a precursor to it, it was interesting, one of the things that Nina had come to me to ask if I would, research this character, because they were having, there wasn't so many, wait, I've got a hanky, I can be a lady about this, watch.
There you go.
Gotta bring that back. There wasn't so much information. I think that a lot of the mining towns, because they weren't established, didn't start already as family-oriented places. They were a little more open, those Mae West. And when I wasn't told where to go with the character. Originally, I was planning to play a Mae West. It seemed like a no-brainer out west. But as I was reading about this, I thought it was so fascinating, and it was more cryptic the bordellos or the higher end boarding houses. And I thought, this is interesting. These are ladies. And they really did. I talked about the furnishings and the wine. That was actually part of the advertisements. And it would say, you know, Molly Ross's house boasts. And that's how I knew that it was such a big deal to have 25 women. Boasts, 25 boarders. It was a lot of kind of sleuthing, looking into the information. There wasn't as much, but you start to put it together. They're boasting about a golden harp. In like your boarding house, we have a golden harp and a piano. It's like, okay, and fine art. But when you think about it, how did they get it? There was no railroad. So they had to get this stuff from the east, or at least Denver or somewhere, and take it up over Leadville or over these passes. That was a big deal. So they didn't have all these fine drink and art and these beautiful instruments. So if somebody had that, then that told you, oh, these were people a little higher end. It was easier to get information on the lower end, the crib girls, mostly just boarding houses, because they were in the police records all the time, which made papers. That's how you were able to figure it out. So it took some sleuthing and then just general reading history books about how prostitution worked, and then seeing that hierarchy. And realizing how it went. As I said, you know, we try to put the history to the best of our ability together. I don't know how Molly got into it. I was trying to trace her back to Leadville because it's absolutely certain that she came from Leadville. But they changed their names each mining town they went to. Wow. So Molly Ross isn't a real name. And then she went on, I don't think she died at Aspen. She owned mines. She was like prosperous. She was a businesswoman. But she did come from Leadville and was you know, one of the girls. So I'm thinking that she just earned money, was smart about it, came to Aspen and right in. While it was early, a mining camp was like, I'm taking a house, get my girls, I know how to do it now. So that was my feeling, and she did have relationships with these people. That's a real court entry about the shooting. Yeah, that's actual, you know, there's a lot of this was pulled out. And it's funny with the papers, you can't completely trust it. So what I had to do was have to find several, right, can't speak. But what happens is when you find several accounts, you start to piece it together and you look for what is consistent. There were some things that are always like, oh come on, nobody else said that. So it's a little different trying to find this, and how I was able to figure out that somebody was a higher end person, and Molly Ross was it would be very interesting when somebody was mentioned in the papers. If it was a lower class place, they'd be like, Joe Smith was seen at Nellie Otis's house. But you would have Mr. O had visited Molly Ross's parlor. So you started to figure out, by figuring it out, which was located on the upper end of Durant. Molly Otis, more in the middle. You know, there were less scuffs. You didn't read about scuffs with Molly Ross. Molly Ross was part of one of the people mentioned in that court where they took everybody in, and the proprietress came, her name was mentioned. And she was actually, you know, mentioned, I think her house was actually listed as 513 Durant Avenue, as she's being the owner, East Durant Avenue, yes, thank you. So it's just kind of interesting how you have to almost sleuth and piece some of it together. But that's what was appealing to me, was that we've all seen Mae West and how fun it is to play her. But I thought, how fun would it be to play somebody who, you know, has proper diction, who speaks well, who can be elegant, but can be a little, you know, racy when she needs to, because that's how she attracts her customers. And my assumption, while I don't know how Molly started, I decided to make her, and I try to pause a little bit, but I don't know that this is true. I just tried to make her one of those soiled doves. Came from a good family, well educated, and something happened to her, and she got labeled, and there was nothing that she could do, and now she was kicked out of society because she got raped, basically, and had to, you know, now make a living. But she was smart, and she could figure out how to do it. So a lot of women had that as their story, and I kind of adopt that for Molly because I cannot find out anything just yet. Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, the railroad came over where the Silver Queen Gondola is today, so that's why it ended up getting moved. That's where they put one on the train station. So if anyone's not from here. That's where the train station came through, so that's why it ended up getting moved.
Sorry, you said that.
Sorry, yeah. The train, the reason why they moved some of the houses is because the train came where the Silver Queen gondola was today. That was one of its train stops. That was the Colorado Midland. So, yeah. So, but yes, does anyone have any other questions for Kimberly?
I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but were there diseases associated with this?
Were there diseases? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And I say that many died of diseases. I try to like point it out without saying, they had venereal.
Yeah, there were diseases.
There was
Yeah.
pregnancy, there was
Syphilis.
syphilis, was it? Yeah, it was just.
Yes. Oh, we have a gentleman.
They died early.
Oh, you're brave.
Pardon me? Sorry.
Were any of the girls
Yes,
buried
they
in
were.
Aspen?
Camille Ritchie. Molly Ross. Actually, that's right. Molly Ross was buried in Aspen. But she headed over. Where did I catch that? I think she just had property up at Castle Creek. I think that was the story. She owned property with Mr. Coe or with somebody else. She owned property with somebody. It was very interesting.
So she's buried here in Aspen?
Well, and that's Molly I got that was buried. I think that Molly was buried in Aspen. I've looked for her grave. Camille Ritchie was supposed to be buried in the Red Hill Cemetery. But that's what it said. It said Red Hill back then.
Oh.
And then I went on Nina's cemetery tour for the sole purpose of like, we gotta find some people here because I can't find these people. I've gone to the Ute Cemetery, I've looked everywhere. They have listings and she's not listed, but that entry, the thing that Mike read for you, that is her actual newspaper obituary. That is a real, like at 9 o'clock, at 5 o'clock, she died of pneumonia and she was cared for. And that was such an unusual thing because regular patrons or citizens actually went to her funeral. And they did not have prostitutes and people mixed. So that was so odd and that just caught my attention right away. And then because it actually said she was from Molly Ross's house, I thought, well, this is very different. So it kind of informed how the rest of it would go.
Wonderful. Yeah. Any other questions for Kimberly? No? Well, awesome. Well, thank you, Kimberly.